Hello, and welcome to Stratagem TV, a series of programmes in which we examine the big issues heading into the Northern Ireland Assembly election. In this episode, we focus on the progress of the last Assembly. Did it provide the foundations of progress, or was it too caught up in its own issues to deal with the challenges that Northern Ireland faces? Looking back at the Assembly term which has just come to a close, what would you say has been the biggest achievements for that Assembly period?
Well, I think it's by common consent that they got to the end of it. But I think their achievements were also their failures. The things they could agree on were free prescription charges, free buses, and no water charges. Very populist measures and making us more dependent on the public purse rather than less.
Well, the big one was the devolution of policing and justice. That was something that early on in '98 people said, well, you can't even address that as something we can't even look at, it's too difficult. And if you remember, there was a terrible kind of caution in the DUP side on it. They tried to get the Orange Order inside, they tried to get the Ulster Unionists. Eventually they agreed it was Sinn Féin. Now nobody would look back on it. It's looked on as a success. Nobody's saying it's a bad thing.
The other thing I'd pick out is the Public Accounts Committee. I think they did a great job on the Northern Ireland water story. I think it was good for two reasons. One, it sent a signal to senior civil servants that when you turn up at a committee at Stormont, you better bring all your notes, you better be open and honest in your answers, and try not to, don't pull the wool over the MLA's eyes. I also think it brought a great report at the end, at the heel of the hunt, from the Auditor General.
I think the Assembly has developed very much so. I've seen certainly MLAs much more understanding of the political process and the policy and legislative process. I think committee system has worked much better. I think towards year 3, year 4 of the Assembly, you can see MLAs beginning to understand exactly the power of Assembly committees and their role in scrutiny. So that was quite useful. It was also useful to organisations who are seeking to influence, because you have a much broader group of MLAs. And again, you can have a longer debate with them than those MLAs that maybe touch on just one issue as part of an Assembly debate. So the mechanics of the Assembly is starting to work, I think, much better, and has worked much better in years 3 and 4.
They have begun to set out some of the big challenges. Of course, we can point to things where they have failed to reach agreement, but in the main, they have done really well. They have been the focus of debate. Nobody can say that politics doesn't affect their lives. We may disagree with some of the decisions, but nobody can say that they haven't been on the case and they haven't been delivering those basic services into society. Now we're arguing about the quality of those decisions, the joined-upness of those decisions, the integration to the future demands, and those are all good things that we're now talking about.
Were there any outstanding ministers or even backbench MLAs who stood out in your mind?
I think there were several. I certainly have been impressed, and I would start actually with the Speaker. I think the Speaker has done a very good job, and that's not an easy job in a power-sharing administration. I've been impressed by ministers who have held on to their portfolio. For example, I think the fact that Margaret Ritchie made housing, and in particular social housing, her priority was a real plus for the housing sector, and we've greatly benefited, and I have to say communities have greatly benefited from the new build social housing programme.
The people I would pick out would be Dawn Purvis. I think she was responsible for one woman operation. She's responsible for an awful lot of work and activity involved in it, and not useless activity, good, strong activity.
Arlene Foster obviously comes across as quite formidable, and I think is somebody you would obviously watch for maybe a higher post at some point in the future.
I think you have to commend Sammy Wilson, who came with the image of being a bit of a clown and yet has risen to the role of pushing through and winning agreement on a 4-year budget in such difficult governmental circumstances. We're in a compulsory coalition. You can look at Edwin Poots, who has become an environment and a planning minister with some authority. You can look at Michelle Gildernew in agriculture and say here was someone who had no obvious background or skills in that arena, and yet doesn't appear to have put many foot strong in the agriculture field.
Who else? Alex Atwood, I think, was very proactive. Martin McGuinness and Peter Robinson both stood out because they kept the show on the road. They managed, although there was, I'm sure, a lot of squabbling in the background between advisors, they managed to keep a show of unity, and particularly on things like the dissident attacks and so on. So, I mean, they stood out, they were a class act, but, they need to do something else, a new one.
Are there any issues which you believe the Assembly could have handled better, or things that they should have done but perhaps didn't do as well as they ought to have done?
How long have you got? I mean, there's not an anti-poverty strategy. There's not a this. There's not a that. There's not the other. Everything, in a funny sort of way, what's happened in Stormont is that we have continued the peace process principle of nothing is agreed until everything's agreed.
I think in many ways there's been too much and elongated consultation. I think we'd rather ministers got on and discharged their responsibilities, and so many of the decisions that we've been waiting for have been long delayed because of huge periods of consultation on some issues. Education
was a complete mess. That the anarchy was created there. We still have more kids leaving school without qualifications. That doesn't seem to have been addressed. The debate's all been about excellence in the 11+, not about meeting the needs of industry, ensuring young people learn. And you had a minister who tried to create a non-selective, a non-academically selective system of entry to secondary schools, and ended up producing a privatised one, which I'm sure was the opposite of what you wanted. That's partly a function of the silo mentality, where you don't have to get consensus in these things in the Assembly.
I think where they missed some opportunities were around real chances for policy consensus on those big issues. Many people were very disappointed when this Assembly, the very first since devolution, did not really grab the nettle of shared future and didn't set out a very long-term and sustainable plan for bringing communities together and doing that, embedding that across delivery, both in education, in housing and in health.
There's certainly ways in which ministers are simply not communicating with each other. The health portfolio was handled in such a way that, as he left, Michael Majimsey somehow thought it would be to his advantage to announce that he wasn't going to build this radiotherapy unit in Derry, when quite clearly monies had been promised from the Republic's government.
You also had the big problem of parties guarding their own interests, and I think that was responsible for the failure to reform local government. And the failure to reform the Creating Education and Skills Authority to replace the Education and Library Boards.
Well, apart from all the obvious ones, I suppose symptomatic of some of the difficulties they had, in tourism terms, one of the things that we're desirous of is a national park, and during the time of this government there have been national parks designated both in Scotland and in the south of England. All the legislation's been put in place, everybody's happy. They are of significant tourism benefit to those areas where they have been designated. Sammy Wilson did a lot of trawling to find out what was required and was minded to bring stuff forward, but in parliamentary timetabling terms, as I understand, Edwin Poots picked up the baton and had a choice between bringing forward enabling legislation for a national park or doing something on high hedges, and so managed to bring the high hedges through, and we're all very grateful to him.
I think we give them a very hard time sometimes. Where I think politicians need to improve is we need to spend less time seeing the Assembly and the Executive and its existence as a novelty. The days of seeing the Executive and the Assembly as a novelty are over. We need to now focus on what are the policy outcomes and the policy solutions. We need to have a debate on education, but we need to be able to have a debate on the future of education without it becoming a political crisis. We need to have debates where there are policy disagreements without threats of Assembly suspension. Those days need to be over, and frankly, I think the public won't stand for it for much longer.